December 26, 1944. The time, 6:47 a.m. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams found himself positioned in his Sherman's turret on an ice-covered Belgian hillside. His gaze fixed northward. Bastogne lay ahead. Snow had begun its descent at midnight. The mercury had plummeted to 18 degrees below zero. His tanker's jacket offered little protection against the biting wind. His binoculars pressed hard against his face, though his frozen fingers could barely register their presence. 5 miles separated him from the town. Within its confines, 10,000 paratroopers from the 101st Airborne found themselves trapped, encircled by German forces, their ammunition dwindling, their food supplies vanishing, time slipping away. 8 days had passed since the encirclement began. The Germans had demanded capitulation. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe had delivered his response in a single defiant word: nuts. That response had resonated throughout the Allied forces. It became a symbol of hope during what many considered the war's darkest hour. Yet hope couldn't deflect incoming shells. Hope couldn't sustain starving soldiers. Hope couldn't replenish the ammunition that diminished with each passing hour. Abrams faced a critical mission. His 37th Tank Battalion had been engaged in relentless combat for 5 consecutive days, pushing through snow, fog, and fierce German opposition. Their progress, a mere 22 miles. 5 additional miles now stood between them and Bastogne. 5 miles defended by German paratroopers, bristling with anti-tank weapons, seeded with mines, and covered in treacherous ice. 5 miles that might as well have stretched to infinity. At 30 years old, Abrams had commanded the 37th Tank Battalion for over a year. During that period, he had molded it into a formation the German army had learned to respect and fear. His soldiers knew him as Colonel Abe. Their loyalty stemmed from trust. That trust was earned through consistent, unwavering leadership. The Germans had their own designation for his unit, the division that never stops. The 4th Armored Division had entered combat on French soil 5 months prior. Since that moment, they had achieved results that defied probability. Conservative estimates placed German casualties at 13,600 killed, approximately 30,000 wounded, and over 90,000 captured. The most remarkable statistic, however, was this: when the war concluded, official records documented only 1 man from the 4th Armored Division remaining in permanent enemy captivity. While brief captures occurred during combat operations, American counterattacks consistently recovered these soldiers before the Germans could evacuate them to prison camps. The division's institutional commitment to immediate rescue operations meant virtually no one remained a prisoner for extended periods. 1 man, from nearly 11,000 soldiers, against an enemy that had imprisoned hundreds of thousands of Allied servicemen throughout the conflict. The statistics seemed impossible. They appeared to contradict logic itself. Yet they were documented, verified, and real. This extraordinary record originated with the man who built the division, Major General John Shirley Wood. The 4th Armored Division received its activation orders on April 15, 1941, at Pine Camp in upstate New York. Brigadier General Henry W. Baird assumed initial command. The division formed around a corps of approximately 3,800 men transferred from the 1st Armored Division. Additional personnel came as draftees from the northeastern states: Pennsylvania farm boys, New Jersey factory workers, Massachusetts college students pulled from their studies 8 months before Pearl Harbor shattered American neutrality. These men possessed no knowledge of tanks. They understood nothing of mobile warfare. They represented raw material awaiting formation. John Wood would be their sculptor. Wood's birth occurred on January 11, 1888, in Monticello, Arkansas. His father, Carroll D. Wood, served on the Arkansas Supreme Court. The younger Wood completed his chemistry degree at the University of Arkansas in 1907, finishing in just 3 years. West Point followed, with graduation in 1912. His service record included the First World War and advanced study at the École de Guerre in Paris, where French masters of armored doctrine shaped his thinking. When Wood assumed command of the 4th Armored in May 1942, He was 54, ancient by armored warfare standards. Yet would grasp something younger commanders frequently missed. Tanks didn't win battles. Men won battles. Tanks were merely implements. The critical question was whether the men operating those implements had been trained to process information and make decisions faster than their adversaries. Wood devoted 2 complete years to training the 4th Armored before it encountered its first enemy. 2 years. Most divisions received 6 months of preparation. Some received less. Wood demanded more time, fought for additional months, and secured them. The training began at Pine Camp, where brutal New York winters tested both equipment and personnel, freezing men to their vehicles. The division relocated to Camp Forest in Tennessee for First Corps maneuvers in October 1942, where tankers learned to operate in rolling terrain and dense forests. Then came the Desert Training Center at Camp Ibis in California, where the 4th Armored became the first armored division to train in that unforgiving environment. Temperatures reached 120 degrees. Sand infiltrated engines within hours. The California desert proved merciless. Heat exhaustion claimed men regularly. Vehicles suffered constant mechanical failures. Supply lines extended across hundreds of miles of barren wasteland. Wood considered it ideal preparation. Wood pushed his men beyond what they thought possible. Tank crews performed maintenance in scorching heat, then immediately launched into mock assaults against fortified positions. Night exercises required navigation by compass through terrain where every direction looked identical. He staged surprise ambushes and criticized any commander who failed to establish proper security measures. Louisiana swamps became their next training ground during Third Army maneuvers. Wood made them march until their feet bled, then ordered them to march farther. Exercises lasted 48 hours without sleep. He replicated German tactics, German weaponry, German strategic thinking. Veterans remembered those Louisiana exercises with mixed feelings, exhaustion combined with profound gratitude. At the time, they couldn't comprehend Wood's harshness. Then France happened. Everything the Germans threw at them, they had already encountered in training. Nothing surprised them. They knew the responses. Wood studied German doctrine with obsessive intensity. He examined captured manuals. He debriefed officers who had observed German operations in Poland and France. He learned how panzer divisions coordinated their attacks, exploited breakthroughs, maintained momentum. Then he trained his men to execute it better. Wood believed the key was combined arms coordination. Tanks operating alone were vulnerable. Infantry alone moved too slowly. Artillery alone couldn't hold terrain. But tanks, infantry, and artillery working in perfect synchronization, supporting one another, covering each other's weaknesses. That combination became unstoppable. He organized his division into combat commands, each built around a tank battalion, an armored infantry battalion, and an artillery battalion. Each combat command functioned as a self-contained fighting force capable of independent operations. They could divide to strike multiple objectives simultaneously or combine for concentrated assaults. The commanders of these combat commands became some of America's most capable officers. Brigadier General Holmes Dagger led Combat Command B. Colonel Bruce Clark commanded Combat Command A through summer and fall 1944, leading during the crucial Battle of Arracourt. Clark would transfer to the 7th Armored Division on November 1, 1944, earning fame defending St. Vith during the Battle of the Bulge. Brigadier General Herbert Ernest took command of Combat Command A in December, leading it during Bastogne's relief. All three would achieve general officer rank after the war. All credited Wood with teaching them everything they knew about armored warfare. Wood taught them one principle above all others: speed. Speed and aggression. Never stop moving. Never allow the enemy time to establish defenses. Strike before he knows you're coming. Strike again before he recovers. Continue striking until he breaks. Wood drilled this philosophy into every man in the division, from tank commanders to cooks and clerks. Everyone learned to shoot. Everyone learned vehicle maintenance. Everyone learned their job was to move forward, always forward, never backward. never stopping until the enemy was destroyed. The men began calling their commander Tiger Jack, partly due to his aggressive tactics, partly because when General George Patton yelled at him during planning sessions, Wood would pace like a caged tiger, growling under his breath. Fellow officers also called him P, short for professor, because he had tutored struggling classmates at West Point. Wood refused to give the division an official nickname. When staff officers asked what they should call themselves, Wood answered simply, 4th Armored Division is name enough. They shall be known by their deeds alone. The division would eventually receive the designation Breakthrough Division in 1954, though that name was later discontinued. But during the war, and for decades after, veterans simply called it Name Enough, a reference to Wood's original statement. July 11, 1944. The 4th Armored Division came ashore at Utah Beach in Normandy. They had crossed the Atlantic in convoy, trained for an additional 6 months in England, and now faced actual combat. The crossing had been uneventful but tense. German submarines still prowled the Atlantic, though their numbers had diminished significantly. The men spent 13 days at sea, sleeping in cramped holds, playing cards, writing letters they hoped wouldn't be their last. England served as a staging area. The division practiced amphibious landings on British beaches, calibrated weapons, and drew equipment. They received the latest Sherman tank model, the M4A3 with the 76mm gun, a significant improvement over earlier variants. They also received briefings on what awaited them in France. The briefings proved inadequate. Most men were terrified. Normandy's hedgerows had already consumed thousands of American lives. German defenders used the dense bocage to establish ambushes, channeling advancing forces into kill zones, transforming every field into a death trap. American infantry divisions were suffering massive casualties for gains measured in hundreds of yards. The 4th Armored Division moved into the line on July 15th. First combat came 2 days later near the town of Perriers. It was a probing attack designed to test German defenses and identify weak points. The attack at Perriers proved costly. The division lost 14 tanks and over 100 men in 2 days of fighting. But they learned. They learned how German anti-tank guns were positioned. They learned how infantry supported those guns. They learned where the weaknesses existed. More importantly, they learned their training worked. Units under fire responded instantly, without waiting for orders. Tank crews that lost their vehicles grabbed rifles and fought as infantry. Medics ran forward under fire to treat the wounded. Everything Wood had taught them came together. The 4th Armored entered combat on July 17th. Within 11 days, they had broken through the German lines. Operation Cobra, the Allied breakout from Normandy, commenced on July 25th. The plan called for massive aerial bombardment to shatter German defenses, followed by armored thrusts through the gaps. The 4th Armored Division was assigned to spearhead the advance through one of these gaps. The bombing began at 9:40 in the morning. Over 1,500 heavy bombers dropped thousands of tons of explosives on a narrow strip of German positions. Some bombs fell short, killing over 100 American soldiers, including Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, the highest-ranking American officer killed by enemy action in the European theater. But the effect on the Germans was catastrophic. Entire units ceased to exist. Survivors stumbled through craters in shock, unable to offer organized resistance. When the 4th Armored advanced that afternoon, they found German soldiers wandering aimlessly, too stunned to fight or surrender. General Patton, whose 3rd Army had just become operational, gave Wood a simple order: go as fast as you can, as far as you can, until somebody stops you. Nobody stopped them. The next 2 weeks redefined what armored warfare could accomplish. The 4th Armored Division didn't advance in a continuous line. They launched multiple thrusts simultaneously, keeping the Germans guessing about their main objective. Combat Command A might be racing toward one town, while Combat Command B swung around to cut the road behind it. The division swept south to take Nantes, cutting off the Brittany Peninsula on August 12, 1944. They trapped 40,000 Germans at Brest. Then they wheeled east and raced across France north of the Loire River, while German commanders tried desperately to determine where they would strike next. They smashed across the Moselle River between September 11th and 13th, flanked the city of Nancy, and captured Lunéville on September 16th. The speed of the advance stunned both the Germans and the Allied High Command. The logistical challenges were immense. Supply trucks couldn't keep pace with advancing tanks. Fuel ran out constantly. Wood ordered his men to capture German supply dumps intact whenever possible, and they often operated vehicles on captured fuel. When fuel couldn't be found, they simply stopped, refueled from whatever arrived, and started again. The speed was devastating. German units would receive reports of American tanks approaching from the west, only to be hit from the south an hour later. Supply columns were overrun before they could unload their cargo. Command posts were captured with maps still spread on tables and coffee still warm in cups. One captured German officer, a colonel from the 352nd Infantry Division, expressed his frustration to American interrogators. "We could not understand how you moved so fast. Our doctrine said that armored divisions needed days to reposition for new attacks. Your division did it in hours. By the time we established a defensive line, you were already behind us." The secret wasn't just speed. It was coordination. Wood had trained his men to operate as a single organism. Tank battalions, armored infantry, artillery, and reconnaissance all moving together in perfect synchronization. When one unit hit resistance, others maneuvered around it. When an opportunity appeared, everyone exploited it simultaneously. The division developed its own communication shortcuts, its own tactical language, its own instincts. Tank commanders learned to read the movement of friendly vehicles and adjust their own positions without waiting for orders. Artillery forward observers rode in the lead tanks and called in fire missions while still under enemy fire. Engineers cleared obstacles and repaired bridges so fast that the advance never slowed. And through it all, Wood was there. Not in a headquarters miles behind the lines, but in a light L-4 Piper Cub aircraft flown by his personal pilot, Major Charles Carpenter. Wood would fly over his advancing columns, spot German positions, and land directly next to his forward commanders to deliver orders in person. Carpenter became famous in his own right. He had mounted 6 M1A1 bazooka rocket tubes on the wings of his tiny observation plane, which he called Rosie the Rocketer. When he spotted German armor, he would dive on it and fire. The Germans called him the Mad Major. His fellow Americans called him Bazooka Charlie. By war's end, he was officially credited with destroying 6 German tanks from his flimsy little aircraft. September 18, 1944. The 4th Armored Division faced its greatest test. The advance across France had finally stalled, not because of German resistance, but because of logistics. The Allied supply line stretched all the way back to the Normandy beaches, over 400 miles away. Fuel that should have gone to Patton's Third Army was being diverted to other operations, including Field Marshal Montgomery's attempt to capture the bridges in the Netherlands. The 4th Armored had stopped at the Moselle River in the Lorraine region of eastern France. They had established bridgeheads and pushed forward toward Nancy, but they couldn't sustain a full-scale offensive. They were waiting for supplies that might never come. The Germans saw an opportunity. The German 5th Panzer Army, commanded by General Otto von Manschenfeld, launched a massive counterattack near the town of Arracourt. Von Manschenfeld had taken command of 5th Panzer Army on September 1, 1944. The Germans had been secretly assembling forces for weeks. They had brought in 2 new panzer brigades, the 111th and 113th, equipped with the latest Panther tanks straight from the factories. They added elements of the veteran 11th Panzer Division and assembled 262 tanks and assault guns in total. Their objective: destroy the American bridgehead and push the 4th Armored back across the Moselle. Hitler himself had ordered the attack. He was convinced that a decisive victory in Lorraine could stabilize the Western Front and give Germany time to prepare new defenses. The 4th Armored Division had 163 tanks. They were outnumbered nearly 2-1. The German Panthers had heavier armor and more powerful guns than the American Shermans. The Panther's 75mm gun could penetrate a Sherman's armor at 2,000 yards. The Sherman's gun needed to be within 500 yards to have a reasonable chance of penetrating a Panther. On paper, the battle should have been a German victory. It was not. The first German attack came on the morning of September 19th. Heavy fog blanketed the battlefield, reducing visibility to a few hundred yards. The Germans advanced in multiple columns, expecting to overwhelm the thin American defenses. They ran into prepared positions manned by men who had spent 2 years learning exactly this kind of fighting. Combat Command A of the 4th Armored Division held the area around Arracourt. Colonel Bruce Clark, its commander, had positioned his tanks in hull-down positions, with only their turrets visible above the ridgelines. His infantry dug in around the tanks, covering the approaches with machine guns and bazookas. His artillery registered on likely avenues of German advance. When the first German tanks emerged from the fog, Clark's gunners were waiting. The Battle of Arracourt lasted 11 days. When it ended, the Germans had lost 200 of their 262 armored vehicles to a combination of combat losses and mechanical breakdowns. The 4th Armored Division had lost 48 tanks across all of September. The Americans won because of training, because of tactics, because of the principles that Wood had drilled into his men for 2 years before they ever saw combat. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams commanded the 37th Tank Battalion during the battle. He had taken over the unit in September 1943. He was 29 years old, from Springfield, Massachusetts, and had graduated from West Point in 1936, ranking 185th out of 276 cadets. Abrams was not an impressive physical specimen. He was stocky with a square face and thinning hair. He smoked cigars constantly and spoke in a flat New England accent. He didn't look like a hero, but he led like one. Abrams led from the front. He named his Sherman tank Thunderbolt and painted the name in large white letters on the turret so his men could always see where he was. He believed that a commander's place was at the point of maximum danger, where his presence could inspire his men and where he could see the battlefield clearly. This was dangerous. Tank commanders who exposed themselves were vulnerable to snipers, artillery, and small arms fire. Several of Abrams's contemporaries were killed or wounded leading from exposed positions. Abrams accepted the risk because he believed the benefits outweighed the costs. By the end of the war, he would go through 7 Thunderbolts. None of them was ever destroyed by enemy fire while he was inside. Abrams always got out before that happened. His tank might be disabled, burning, or about to explode. But Abrams was already rallying another crew, commandeering another vehicle, getting back into the fight. At Arracourt, Abrams understood that the fog and rain covering the battlefield neutralized the Germans' greatest advantage. The Panthers had superior guns that could destroy Shermans at 2,000 yards, but in the fog, visibility dropped to a few hundred feet. At that range, the Sherman's 75mm gun was just as deadly as the Panther's 75. Abrams worked closely with Major Harold Cohen, who commanded the 10th Armored Infantry Battalion. The two men developed an extraordinary partnership, with Cohen's infantry and Abrams's tanks operating in perfect coordination. This tank infantry teamwork became a model for the entire division. Abrams positioned his tanks in hull-down positions behind ridges and in tree lines. He let the Germans come to him. When they appeared out of the fog, his gunners were already sighted in, already waiting. Corporal John Gatsovsky was the gunner on Abrams's own tank, Thunderbolt. Nobody knew exactly how many German tanks Gatsovsky destroyed during the war, but everyone agreed it was more than any other gunner in the division. At Arracourt, he knocked out tank after tank as German formations stumbled into American ambushes. On September 20th, the Germans launched their heaviest attack. A company of Panthers advanced toward the 4th Armored Headquarters at Arracourt. 2 of Abrams's tank companies were outflanked and disorganized by the assault. Abrams didn't wait for reinforcements. He counterattacked with his command tank alone. His citation for the Distinguished Service Cross describes what happened next. Lieutenant Colonel Abrams unhesitatingly attacked the enemy force with his command tank, striking with such ferocity that the enemy was thrown into a state of confusion and his own forces were able to regroup. He then led his reorganized companies in a frontal assault which resulted in the complete rout of the enemy. The Battle of Arracourt broke the back of the German counteroffensive in Lorraine. More importantly, it proved that American tank crews, properly trained and properly led, could defeat German armor even when outnumbered and outgunned. The 4th Armored Division claimed 281 German tanks destroyed during the Lorraine campaign. They killed approximately 3,000 Germans and captured 3,000 more. They also fought and defeated several German Panzergrenadier brigades in the Lorraine area, including SS Panzergrenadier Brigade 49 and SS Panzergrenadier Brigade 51. The division's own losses were comparatively light. The secret was not magic. It was not luck. It was the culture that Wood had built and that commanders like Abrams maintained. The 4th Armored Division did not leave wounded men behind. They did not abandon broken-down vehicles. They did not let stragglers fall into enemy hands. When a tank was disabled, other tanks covered its crew while they escaped. When infantry was pinned down, armor came forward to break the enemy position. When anyone was in trouble, everyone responded. This was not standard army practice. Many divisions accepted that some men would be captured. It was an inevitable cost of war. Prisoners of war were an administrative problem, not a tactical concern. You did your best to avoid losing men, but sometimes it happened. Wood refused to accept this logic. He made rescue operations a priority. He trained his men to react instantly when comrades were in danger. He created a culture where every soldier knew, without any doubt, that his brothers would come for him. The division also moved so fast that the Germans rarely had time to evacuate prisoners. When American tanks overran German positions, any prisoners the Germans had taken were often liberated before they could be moved to the rear. Speed protected men in ways that static warfare never could. German intelligence reports from late 1944 mention the 4th Armored Division repeatedly. They describe it as unusually aggressive, unusually mobile, and unusually difficult to engage decisively. One report notes that prisoners from the division were almost impossible to keep because American units always counterattacked to rescue their men before they could be evacuated. Then came December. Then came the Ardennes. The fall of 1944 had been frustrating for the 4th Armored Division. After the stunning successes of August and September, the advance had ground to a halt. Supply shortages, strengthening German defenses, and the terrible weather of a European winter combined to slow everything down. The division spent November and early December in defensive positions along the Saar River, probing German fortifications, conducting limited attacks, waiting for the resources to resume the offensive. After a brief rest following Arracourt, the division returned to combat on November 9th with an attack near Viviers. They cleared Biedestroff on November 12th, advanced through Duez, and crossed the Saar River between November 21st and 22nd to establish a bridgehead. They captured the towns of Singling and Beining before being relieved on December 8th, just 8 days before the German offensive began. Then the Germans attacked. On December 16, 1944, 200,000 German soldiers launched the largest offensive on the Western Front since D-Day. They struck through the Ardennes forest, the same route the Wehrmacht had used to conquer France in 1940. They achieved complete tactical surprise. American units in the path of the attack were overwhelmed. The German plan was ambitious. Hitler believed he could split the Allied armies in two, capture the vital port of Antwerp, and force the Western Allies to negotiate a separate peace. It was a desperate gamble, but Germany was desperate. The war was lost unless something dramatic changed. The weather favored the attack. Low clouds and fog grounded Allied aircraft. Snow and ice made movement difficult, but also concealed German preparations. The Americans had thinned their lines in the Ardennes, believing the terrain was too difficult for major operations. They were wrong. The Germans advanced 50 miles in the first week. They surrounded Bastogne, a critical road junction that controlled movement throughout the region. The 101st Airborne Division rushed into the town as reinforcements, found itself cut off and besieged. General Dwight Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, called an emergency meeting on December 19th. He needed someone to relieve Bastogne. He needed it done fast. George Patton stood up. He told Eisenhower that he could attack within 48 hours. Eisenhower was skeptical. Patton had 6 divisions engaged in combat along the Saar River, facing the opposite direction. To attack toward Bastogne, he would have to disengage those divisions, turn them 90 degrees, and move them over 100 miles through winter conditions. Patton said he could do it. He had already prepared contingency plans for exactly this situation. His staff had wargamed the possibility of a German offensive through the Ardennes weeks earlier. When Patton left the meeting, he called his headquarters and spoke 2 words: play ball. Within hours, 3 divisions were on the move. The 4th Armored Division led the way. The division raced northwest into Belgium, covering 150 miles in just 19 hours. It was an extraordinary feat of logistics and endurance. Snow covered the roads. Ice made them treacherous. Temperatures dropped below zero. The men had no winter clothing, no heated vehicles, no hot food. They kept moving anyway. Major General Hugh Gaffey had taken command of the 4th Armored on December 3rd, when Wood was relieved due to exhaustion and conflicts with his corps commander. Gaffey was a different kind of commander than Wood, less charismatic, more methodical. But he understood what the 4th Armored could do, and he pushed them to do it. Gaffey organized his forces into 3 combat commands for the relief operation. Brigadier General Herbert Ernest commanded Combat Command A, which would make the main effort along the Arlon to Bastogne road. Brigadier General Holmes Dagger led Combat Command B on the western flank. Colonel Wendell Blanchard commanded Combat Command Reserve, which would ultimately make the breakthrough. By December 20th, the division had reached the southern edge of the German penetration. They attacked immediately. The next 5 days were among the hardest fighting the 4th Armored had ever experienced. German paratroopers of the 5th Parachute Division defended every village, every crossroads, every bridge. The terrain was terrible for armor. Forests, ravines, and frozen streams channeled the tanks into predictable routes where German anti-tank guns waited. Ernest Combat Command A faced brutal resistance at Martelange and Warneck. The Germans had fortified both towns heavily. At Warneck on December 23rd and 24th, the fighting was particularly savage. American infantry and tanks attacked from 3 directions before finally securing the village. The losses on both sides were heavy. Meanwhile, Dagger's Combat Command B pushed north toward Chaumont, but was stopped by fierce German counterattacks. The gap between the 2 combat commands grew as Dagger advanced faster than Ernest could break through. The division was stretched dangerously thin. The weather made everything worse. Snow fell constantly. The roads, already narrow and winding, became sheets of ice. Tanks slid off roads and into ditches. Half-tracks lost traction on hills and rolled backward. The cold froze the oil in engines and the grease in gun mechanisms. The German defenders knew what was at stake. If the Americans broke through to Bastogne, the entire Ardennes offensive might collapse. They fought with desperate intensity. At Bougainville, the Germans had fortified every building. Machine guns covered every approach. Anti-tank guns were concealed in barns and behind stone walls. The 37th Tank Battalion attacked on December 22nd and fought for 9 hours before finally securing the village. They lost 4 tanks and over 30 men. At Bernon, the Germans launched a counterattack on Christmas Eve that nearly overran the American position. Abrams called an artillery fire on his own positions to break up the German assault. The shells landed within yards of American foxholes. Several men were wounded by friendly fire, but the German attack was shattered. Abrams's 37th Tank Battalion was at the point of the advance. His men fought through Bougainville on December 22nd. They took Varnon on Christmas Eve. They captured Remouville on Christmas morning. Christmas Day in the Ardennes was not a day of peace. The men of the 4th Armored woke to artillery barrages and small arms fire. They ate cold rations in their vehicles because there was no time to stop. The chaplain conducted services in the lee of a burned-out German half-track, while mortars exploded 200 yards away. On the morning of December 26th, Abrams stood on that frozen hillside and looked toward Bastogne. His battalion had been in continuous combat for 8 days. They had started with 70 operational tanks. Now they had 21. His men were exhausted, frozen, and running low on ammunition. 5 miles. 5 miles through German lines to reach the paratroopers. Abrams radioed General Gaffey and asked for permission to make a straight run for Bastogne. Forget the flanking maneuvers. Forget the cautious advance. Just blast through whatever was in the way and link up with the 101st. Gaffey gave permission. The breakthrough would come not from Ernest Combat Command A, which had been stalled at Warnock and Martelange, nor from Dagger's Combat Command B. Instead, Colonel Wendell Blanchard's Combat Command Reserve would make the final push. Blanchard had been fighting on the western flank, first capturing Bougainville, then moving west to counter German threats near Sabret. At 3:15 in the afternoon, artillery from 13 American batteries began pounding the village of Assinois, directly in the path of the advance. Over 600 shells hit the village in less than 10 minutes. Buildings collapsed. Fires started. German soldiers who survived the barrage stumbled through the ruins, deaf and disoriented. The shells landed so close to the American tanks that a friendly half-track was hit and disabled. Shrapnel rattled against the armor of the lead Shermans, but they didn't stop. They couldn't stop. Abrams stuck a cigar in his mouth, climbed into the turret of Thunderbolt, and keyed his radio. "We're going into those people now. Let her roll." Company C of the 37th Tank Battalion led the assault under Combat Command Reserve commanded by Colonel Wendell Blanchard. First Lieutenant Charles Boggess commanded the lead tank, an M4A3E2 Jumbo Sherman known as Cobra King. The Jumbo variant had extra armor plating that made it nearly impervious to German anti-tank weapons from front. His orders were simple: drive straight through the village. Do not stop for anything. Do not deviate from the road. Get to Bastogne. The lead company had only 9 tanks. They charged through Assinois at high speed, firing at everything that moved. German soldiers scattered. Anti-tank guns were overrun before they could fire. A German officer stepped into the road with a Panzerfaust anti-tank rocket and was cut down by machine gun fire before he could aim. The column punched through the village in less than 5 minutes. They emerged on the north side and kept going. Behind them, the armored infantry dismounted from their half-tracks and began clearing the buildings. The fighting in Assinois would continue for hours, but the tanks were already gone. Half a mile beyond Assinois, Lieutenant Boggess saw foxholes ahead. He couldn't tell if they were American or German. He ordered his gunner to hold fire and kept advancing. A figure emerged from one of the foxholes, waving. At 4:50 in the afternoon, First Lieutenant Charles Boggess, commanding Cobra King, reached the defensive perimeter of the 101st Airborne. He linked up with 2nd Lieutenant Dwayne Webster of the 326th Airborne Engineer Battalion. The two men shook hands beside Boggess's tank. Boggess asked where the general was. Webster pointed toward the center of town. The siege of Bastogne was broken. Abrams received his 2nd Distinguished Service Cross for his actions during the relief of Bastogne. His first had been awarded for his solo counterattack at Arracourt on September 20th. Abrams arrived 25 minutes later. He reported to Brigadier General McAuliffe in person. The two men shook hands in the freezing darkness, while German shells exploded around them. McAuliffe asked what had taken so long. Abrams smiled around his cigar and said they had run into some traffic. Patton sent a message to General Gaffey that night. "The outstanding celerity of your movement and the unremitting vicious and skillful manner in which you pushed the attack, terminating at the end of 4 days and nights of incessant battle in the relief of Bastogne, constitutes one of the finest chapters in the glorious history of the United States Army." The 4th Armored Division did not stop at Bastogne. They fought for another 5 months across the Rhine, through Germany, into Czechoslovakia. The weeks after Bastogne were brutal. German forces launched repeated counterattacks, trying to close the corridor to the town. The 4th Armored held the line, losing men and tanks daily. By the time the German offensive finally collapsed in late January, the division had suffered over 2,000 casualties since entering the Ardennes. But they did not break. They did not retreat. They held until the German strength was exhausted. 6 weeks after Bastogne, the 4th Armored Division jumped off from Luxembourg City in an eastward plunge. They crossed the Moselle River at Trier, drove south and east to Worms, and reached the Rhine on March 21, 1945. On March 22, elements of Patton's Third Army crossed the Rhine at Oppenheim and Nierstein, beating Field Marshal Montgomery's much-publicized crossing by nearly a day. Patton was delighted. The 4th Armored had crossed the Great River on March 24th and 25th over pontoon bridges built by Army engineers under German artillery fire. Advancing all night, they crossed the main river the next day south of Hanau and continued to push on. They seized an intact bridge across the Main, which aided the rapid advance of 7th Army. The division fought off numerous counterattacks by German armor near Hanau before pressing deeper into Germany. Aschaffenburg fell on March 29. Crailsheim, across the river, fell on April 1st. On April 4, 1945, the 4th Armored Division, along with elements of the 89th Infantry Division, made a discovery that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. They liberated the Ohrdruf concentration camp, the first Nazi camp discovered by American forces. Ohrdruf was a subcamp of the larger Buchenwald concentration camp, established by the SS in November 1944 near the town of Gotha. At its peak in late March 1945, the camp had held approximately 11,700 prisoners. The SS had forced prisoners to construct railway lines and dig large underground caverns inside a nearby mountain for a communications center that was never completed. Conditions at the work site were harsh, unsafe, and unhealthy. As the Americans approached, the SS evacuated thousands of prisoners on foot and in trucks to Buchenwald and toward Rulla. Prisoners too ill to walk were shot by SS guards. Nothing in the soldiers' training had prepared them for what they found. Hundreds of decomposing corpses lay throughout the camp. Some had been partially burned in a hasty attempt to destroy evidence. Survivors were so emaciated they could barely stand. Evidence of torture, medical experiments, and systematic murder defied comprehension. General Eisenhower visited Ohrdruf on April 12th, accompanied by Generals Omar Bradley and George Patton. The evidence of Nazi atrocities shocked the Army leadership. Eisenhower was so affected that he contacted General George Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff, and urged him to send congressional delegations and prominent American newspaper editors to tour the newly liberated camps. Eisenhower wanted as many witnesses as possible to see the evidence firsthand. He ordered every American soldier in the area to tour the camp so they could bear witness. He wanted them to understand what they were fighting against. The 4th Armored Division's discovery of Ohrdruf opened the eyes of many American soldiers to the horrors committed during the Holocaust. The 4th Armored pressed on. By April 12th, they had crossed the Saale River. They liberated prisoner-of-war camps holding American and British soldiers captured earlier in the war. They freed slave laborers from factories. They accepted the surrender of entire German divisions that preferred American captivity to the approaching Soviet army. On May 6th, the division crossed into Czechoslovakia. They established a bridgehead across the Otava River at Strakonis and pushed forward elements to Písek. The 4th Armored had been driving toward Prague when the German surrender came. 2 days later, on May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. When the war ended on May 8, 1945, the 4th Armored Division had been in combat for 230 days. They had advanced farther than any other division in the European theater. They had destroyed or captured 579 German tanks, 3,668 other vehicles, 603 artillery pieces, and 103 locomotives. They had taken 90,354 prisoners. And according to official Army records, only one of their own men remained in German captivity when the war ended. Veterans of the division discussed this statistic for decades after the war. The records note a small number of soldiers were temporarily captured during combat, but the division's culture of immediate counterattack meant they were almost always rescued before being evacuated. The official count of 1 represents soldiers who remained prisoners, not the total ever taken, but even accounting for temporary captures, the ratio remained extraordinary. John Wood did not live to see the end of the war with the 4th Armored. He had been relieved of command on December 3, 1944, officially for health reasons, unofficially because he had made too many enemies among his superiors. Wood was difficult. He argued with his corps commanders. He criticized decisions made above his pay grade. He told more than one superior officer that they were winning the war the wrong way. In August 1944, when he was ordered to besiege the port of Brest instead of continuing his eastward drive, he complained openly that the decision was strategically foolish. He was right about Brest. The port was never used by the Allies. The resources devoted to its capture could have been better employed elsewhere. But being right didn't make Wood easier to work with. He returned to the United States and finished the war commanding a training center at Fort Knox. It was an important job, preparing new armored units for combat, but it was not the same as leading men in battle. After the war, Wood worked for the United Nations, helping refugees in Austria and Korea. He supervised the resettlement of over 1 million displaced persons from the chaos of post-war Europe. He applied the same organizational skills he had used building the 4th Armored to the task of rebuilding shattered lives. He never received another combat command. He died on July 2, 1966, in Reno, Nevada, at the age of 78. After Wood's departure, the 4th Armored was commanded by Major General Hugh Gaffey through the Battle of the Bulge. Brigadier General William M. Hogue took command in March 1945 and was promoted to Major General before the war's end. Major General Fay Prickett commanded during the occupation period. The British military historian Basil Liddell Hart called Wood the Rommel of the American Armored Forces and one of the most dynamic commanders of armor in World War II. Lieutenant General Willis Crittenberger, who had worked with Wood throughout the war, said he far exceeded in his leadership capabilities any man I have ever known. Creighton Abrams became one of the most important soldiers of the 20th century. After the war, he commanded tank units in Germany during the Cold War, facing the Soviet threat that followed the Allied victory. He served in Korea. He commanded the 3rd Armored Division during the Berlin Crisis of 1961. In 1968, he took command of all American forces in Vietnam. He oversaw the transition from search and destroy operations to Vietnamization, the gradual transfer of combat responsibility to South Vietnamese forces. He managed the American withdrawal with professionalism that preserved as much of the Army's honor as possible in an impossible situation. He became Army Chief of Staff in 1972. He oversaw the transition from a conscript army to an all-volunteer force. He reformed training, doctrine, and equipment. He laid the groundwork for the Army that would win the Gulf War 2 decades later. He died of lung cancer on September 4, 1974, at Walter Reed Army Medical Center, just short of his 60th birthday. President Gerald Ford attended his funeral at Arlington National Cemetery. The M1 Abrams main battle tank, the backbone of American armored forces for 4 decades, is named after him. Every soldier who drives that tank carries a piece of Creighton Abrams with them. The men of the 4th Armored scattered after the war. The division returned to the United States on April 25, 1946, and was inactivated the following day, though some elements remained in Germany as occupation forces after redesignation as constabulary units. The veterans went home to Pennsylvania and New Jersey and Massachusetts and all the other places they had come from. They married, raised families, built careers. They didn't talk much about what they had done, but they stayed connected. The 4th Armored Division Association held reunions every year until the last veterans became too old to travel. They shared memories, told stories, remembered the friends they had lost. Perhaps the most important legacy of the 4th Armored Division is not a weapon or a document. It is a principle. The division proved that training matters more than technology. That leadership matters more than numbers. That soldiers who trust each other, who know their commanders will never abandon them, will fight harder and smarter than soldiers who doubt. The 4th Armored didn't have better tanks than other American divisions. They had the same Shermans, the same half-tracks, the same artillery. They didn't have more men or more supplies. They had the same allocations as everyone else. What they had was 2 years of training under a commander who refused to accept mediocrity. What they had was a culture that valued every soldier's life and proved it in action. What they had was the knowledge that they were the best, not because anyone told them so, but because they had earned it through sweat and discipline and sacrifice. Military historians have studied the 4th Armored Division for decades, trying to understand what made them different. They have analyzed the tactics, the equipment, the terrain. They have interviewed veterans and examined records. They have written books and articles and doctoral dissertations. The conclusion is always the same. The difference was not in the tanks. The difference was in the men. John Wood understood something that many commanders never learn. An army is not a machine. It is an organism. It has spirit and morale and culture. Those intangible factors matter more than firepower or armor thickness. A division that believes in itself, that trusts its leaders, that knows it will never be abandoned, can accomplish things that seem impossible. They shall be known by their deeds alone. Wood said those words in 1942, when the division was nothing but raw recruits and borrowed equipment. He couldn't have known then what those deeds would be. He couldn't have imagined the drive across France, the stand at Arracourt, the relief of Bastogne, the final push into Germany. But he knew what he was building. He knew that if he trained them right, if he led them right, they would become something extraordinary. He was right. The 4th Armored Division earned 13 campaign streamers, 2 presidential unit citations, and the French Croix de Guerre with Palm for actions in both Normandy and the Moselle River Campaign. The division was the first American armored division to receive the Presidential Unit Citation. They also received the French Fourragère in the colors of the Croix de Guerre. Individual soldiers earned 34 Distinguished Service Crosses, over 800 Silver Stars, and more than 3,000 Bronze Stars. They produced more than a dozen general officers and countless other distinguished soldiers. They set records that still stand and established standards that other units still try to match. 32 soldiers of the 4th Armored Division remain listed as missing in action to this day, a reminder that even the most successful units paid a heavy price for victory. That is what training can do. That is what leadership can do. That is what a band of brothers, bound together by shared sacrifice and absolute trust, can accomplish when everything is on the line. The 4th Armored Division Association maintained detailed records and published multiple unit histories. Veterans like Albiner Zick, who commanded the 8th Tank Battalion, wrote memoirs that preserved the division story. Historian Hugh M. Cole documented their achievements in the Lorraine Campaign, part of the official U.S. Army history of World War II. The division's motto, "Name Enough," reflected Wood's belief that their actions would speak for themselves. No flashy nickname was necessary. No promotional campaign was required. The record would stand on its own. And it has. Decades after the war ended, military analysts continued to study the 4th Armored Division's record. They examined every battle, every decision, every movement. They tried to isolate the variables that explained the extraordinary success. Some focused on the quality of junior officers, men like Abrams who led from the front and inspired their soldiers through personal example. Others emphasized the division's emphasis on combined arms coordination, with tanks, infantry, and artillery operating as an integrated whole rather than separate elements. Still others pointed to the division's emphasis on speed and aggression, inherited from Wood's philosophy and maintained by his successors. The 4th Armored didn't occupy territory. They flowed through it like water, seeking the path of least resistance, exploiting every weakness, never stopping long enough for the enemy to organize a coherent defense. But perhaps the most important factor was the culture of mutual obligation that permeated the division. Every soldier knew that if he got into trouble, someone would come for him. This wasn't just a policy or a slogan. It was demonstrated repeatedly in action. When a tank broke down, other tanks didn't leave it behind. They covered it while the crew made repairs or evacuated. When infantry was pinned down by enemy fire, armor came forward to suppress the German positions. When anyone was missing, everyone looked for them. This culture had practical military benefits. Soldiers who knew they wouldn't be abandoned fought with greater confidence and took more calculated risks. They pushed harder because they trusted their comrades to support them. They didn't worry about being left behind, so they could focus entirely on the mission. But the culture also had psychological effects that are harder to quantify. The men of the 4th Armored fought not just for their country or for abstract principles, but for each other. They fought to protect the man next to them, to honor the trust that had been placed in them, to prove themselves worthy of their brother's sacrifice. This kind of unit cohesion cannot be manufactured quickly. It requires time, shared experience, and consistent leadership that reinforces the right values. Wood spent 2 years building it. His successors maintained it through their own actions and decisions. The statistical anomaly of only one man remaining in permanent German captivity was not the result of luck or coincidence. It was the natural outcome of a system that prioritized bringing every soldier home. Other American divisions lost hundreds or even thousands of men to German prison camps. The 4th Armored lost essentially none. That difference wasn't because the 4th Armored faced easier opposition. They frequently fought elite German units and suffered heavy casualties in some battles. The difference was that they made recovering their men a priority and backed up that priority with immediate aggressive action. German units learned that capturing soldiers from the 4th Armored was more trouble than it was worth. American counterattacks came so quickly and so violently that the Germans rarely had time to evacuate prisoners before being overrun themselves. German commanders noted this in their reports and adjusted their tactics accordingly, sometimes choosing to bypass isolated American positions rather than risk the immediate American response. The 4th Armored Division's legacy extends beyond World War II. The principles they demonstrated, aggressive leadership, combined arms coordination, emphasis on speed, and absolute commitment to every soldier's life, became fundamental elements of American armored doctrine. The training methods would develop influenced how the U.S. Army trained armored units for decades afterward. The emphasis on realistic, demanding training that pushed soldiers to their limits became standard practice. The concept of extended training periods before combat deployment, while not always achieved due to wartime pressures, remained an ideal that the Army strived to meet. The tactical innovations pioneered by the 4th Armored, rapid maneuver, deep penetrations, bypassing strong points, maintaining momentum, became standard practice for American armored forces. What was revolutionary in 1944 became doctrine by 1950. The cultural legacy proved even more enduring. The idea that no soldier should be left behind, that every life matters, that rescue operations are a command priority. These principles became deeply embedded in American military culture. They were tested and proven in Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan. They remain central to how American forces operate today. Modern military units still study the 4th Armored Division's campaigns. Arracourt is taught as a case study in how to defeat a superior enemy through superior tactics and training. The relief of Bastogne is analyzed for its demonstration of rapid redeployment and sustained offensive operations under adverse conditions. The drive across France is studied for its innovative use of speed and maneuver. The men who served in the 4th Armored rarely spoke of themselves as heroes. When they told their stories, they emphasized their friends, their leaders, their shared experiences. They deflected credit and shared glory. They understood that what they had accomplished required all of them working together, and that individual heroism mattered less than collective excellence. As the veterans aged and passed away, they left behind a record that speaks for itself. The numbers are stark and undeniable. The achievements are documented and verified. The legacy is clear and continuing. They shall be known by their deeds alone. John Wood's words prove prophetic. The 4th Armored Division needed no fancy nickname, no promotional campaign, no marketing effort. Their deeds spoke louder than any words could. They advanced farther, fought harder, and lost fewer men to captivity than any comparable unit in the European theater. They set standards that still inspire and challenge military units today. They proved that with proper training, strong leadership, and absolute commitment to each other, ordinary men can accomplish extraordinary things. The frozen hillside where Creighton Abrams stood on December 26, 1944, is now peaceful farmland. The villages they fought through have been rebuilt. The roads they traveled are paved and quiet. The rivers they crossed flow undisturbed. But the legacy remains. The principles endure. The example stands. That is what John Wood built in 2 years of demanding training. That is what Creighton Abrams and countless other officers maintained through months of brutal combat. That is what 11,000 soldiers created together through their shared sacrifice and mutual trust. They shall be known by their deeds alone, and their deeds are enough.